Greetings, friend. Welcome back. This is Health and Healing brought to you by the Scott Valley Seventh-day Adventist Church, and I'm your host, Dr. Michael Hess. The topic for this episode is rest. Rest is near the end of our New Start acronym, and for a lot of people, rest is at the end of their list of priorities. And when we think about health, most of the time we think about exercise and eating right, maybe even drinking water. But a lot of people don't think about rest as an important part of health. And it is true that nutrition and exercise are very critical, but rest also is very important and often misunderstood. So today we're going to shed a little bit of light on that. When we're talking about rest, I'm going to be talking about sleep mostly today. But keep in mind that rest is not just sleep, but we also include in that the idea of taking time away from work or the other stressors of life, the idea of a holiday or a vacation, time away. And we also include in that the idea of a weekly day of rest, which in the Bible is called the Sabbath. And that's an idea that has gotten a lot more attention in recent years, even in the research. But we'll be looking at that more in a future episode perhaps, but right now we're going to be looking at sleep. I'm going to tell you, when I was doing my medical training, we had a saying that was fairly common: you can sleep when you're dead. We often were overworked, sleep deprived, going as much as, I'll say I know that very commonly would go 36 hours without sleep, sometimes 48 hours or even more in unusual cases. I'm not recommending that you should do that. It's actually one of the things about medical education and training that needs to be fixed, and it is changing now for sure. But yes, it's true that you can sleep when you're dead, but it's also true that if you don't sleep, you will die sooner. So as usual, let's start looking at some of the research, and then we'll talk about practical applications and ideas for you. The first study I want to mention, I already mentioned in our very first episode. It was looking at the relationship between sleep and the risk of the current virus. The researchers looked at 2,884 healthcare workers across 6 different countries, and they evaluated their sleep habits, their feelings of burnout, and their exposures to the virus and testing positive for the virus. And there was a lot of interesting findings in that study, but in particular, the one I'm highlighting today is that they found for each additional hour of sleep, the healthcare workers had a 12% reduction in their risk of getting the virus. And that was even after accounting for the amount of exposure, or what we call controlling for this other factor, the number of exposures. So they matched those up to be of equal exposure, and they found that those who had more sleep were less likely to get the virus. That should be enough to get our attention when we're talking about sleep. Sleep deprivation definitely affects our immune system. It reduces immune function in a number of ways. That's going to be on the scope of our talk today to go into the details of how that works. But it's not just our immune system. Sleep deprivation or not enough sleep has been shown to be associated with a lot of things, including increased risk for stroke, increased risk for dementia and mental health problems, increased risk for heart attacks and diabetes, and all-cause mortality. That famous thing, all-cause mortality. So interestingly, for most of these things, there's what's known as a U-shaped curve in relationship to sleep. In other words, not enough sleep is a risk factor, but also too much sleep can increase your risk. And I know some of you are saying, too much sleep, what's that? Well, it is actually a thing. So, for example, there was a large meta-analysis looking at, and a meta-analysis is when researchers gather up a bunch of studies on a certain topic. They find the ones that have all of the relevant information in the data collection, and they aggregate that, or they put the information together to hopefully get a more solid answer. So in this particular meta-analysis, they looked at sleep in relationship to the risk of diabetes, and what they found was that for people who slept 7 to 8 hours had the lowest risk of diabetes. There were about 500,000 participants in all of these studies that were aggregated together. So that the graph looks like this, and you can see it's called a U shape because it's sort of roughly shaped like a U. And here on this axis we have our relative risk of developing diabetes, and on this axis we have the hours of sleep. So what we find is that the lowest was just about at 8 hours. A little bit, just less than 8 hours was the lowest risk of developing diabetes. And for people who slept fewer than 7 hours, you can see there's a significant increase in their risk of developing diabetes. And for people who slept significantly more than 8 hours, also there's a significant risk in developing diabetes. That U-shaped relationship between the number of hours of sleep and the risk has been found in many other diseases. And I'm not going to go through all of those. I'll leave a few links in the description below to that particular study and a number of others that show this sort of relationship. One that I found fascinating was actually a twin study where they looked at twins. So there's a genetic link, and they evaluated mental health and sleep habits. And what they found was also that there was this U-shaped association, so that people who had between 7 and 9 hours of sleep had the lowest risk of depression and anxiety symptoms. But they also went further and described it as a bidirectional relationship. In other words, the number of hours that you sleep affects your mental health, and your mental health affects the number of hours that you sleep. And that may not be surprising to you. If you don't sleep enough, you might get kind of grouchy, and if you sleep too much, that could also be the case. So there's this bidirectional relationship, and for me, what that really highlights is that we need to consider health in a holistic way. We can't really just think, well, there's this collection of all these separate things and they're unrelated, but we'll just do the best we can with this, and I'll sleep and it'll be fine. What it means is we need to pay attention to our sleep to try to optimize our sleep, and we also need to pay attention to our mental health and if we need to get help with that, or addressing any symptoms that come up and underlying causes there, so that our overall health can get better rather than spiraling down. I often like to describe it as, well, if you've been on a downward spiral, we want to interrupt that and reverse it so that you can go on an upward spiral to get better and better as things go along. Another study I'll reference was another meta-analysis looking at sleep and all-cause mortality. And this one, they aggregated data from over 1 million participants. That's a pretty large collection of individuals that data was collected on. And they found for people who slept less than 7 hours, there was a 12% increase in the risk of dying from any cause. And for people who slept more than 9 hours, although some of the studies used more than 8 hours and some used more than 10, but on average it seemed like more than 9 hours increased their risk of dying by 30%. And there's a lot of discussion, is that a cause-effect relationship or just a correlation? And I think it's some of both. Certainly if you're not sleeping well, that's going to increase your risk of dying from a number of different things. And also, if you're dying from something, that may cause you to be more sleepy. And so you'll sleep more because you're dying. So practically, what does this mean? How much should you sleep? Well, I think the data is pretty clear. The sweet spot is somewhere between that 7 to 9 hours. The exact number is going to vary depending on you. Everyone's a little bit different, so there's a range there, and your particular circumstances, which could change over time. I want to review a few other elements of what we call sleep hygiene. That is, the things that you can do to have a good night's sleep. And really important here is also going to be the timing of when we sleep. There's less research on that, although there is some, but we want to generally think about having the middle of our sleep time in the middle of the night. In other words, we don't want to wait until after midnight to go to sleep, and we also don't really want to go to sleep really, really early and be out by midnight for the rest of the night. So the middle of sleep time in the middle of the night, not necessarily what your clock says, but the actual circadian rhythm, the day-night cycle. So when the sun goes down and when the sun comes up, so halfway in between that is probably a good area to have the middle of your sleep. And it doesn't have to be precisely that way, but that's a good rule of thumb. Another thing to consider is if you are sleeping less than 7 hours a night or more than 9 hours a night, you might want to get some help figuring out what's going on with that, because it's really not ideal. So you may want to talk to a doctor about why you're not sleeping well, to see if there's some things we can do to improve that. And also another thought is, if you're sleeping, maybe you're sleeping 7 or 8 or 9 hours a night, but you're still sleepy during the day and you're not feeling refreshed, that could be an indication of other problems such as sleep apnea or some other things. So if that's you, please reach out to someone and get some help with that. So let me just wrap this up with a few tips for getting a good night's sleep. First is going to be have a consistent bedtime. So if that's 10 o'clock, try to keep it at 10 o'clock very regularly. 9 o'clock, 10:30, whatever it may be, try to be consistent with that. That's going to help your body to be able to get into a regular rhythm of sleeping and waking at a certain time. That's better for our body to have that rhythm, and if it's in sync with the natural world, so much better. Second one is going to be just have your place for sleeping, your bed, be just for sleep, not for a bunch of other things. Yes, I know, for sleep and for, shall we say, marital relationships. But other than that, we want to keep all the other activities out of the bed. Watching television, scrolling on your phone, eating, whatever those other activities are, do them somewhere else. So if you have to watch television, which is actually another one, turn your screens off an hour before bedtime. So if you're going to watch television, go do that somewhere else in the house. When it's bedtime, the screen should be off, and you go to bed to sleep. All right, so that was number 3, I guess, turn off the screens at least an hour before bed. Number 4 is get some exercise. We talked about exercise earlier in a prior episode. You get some exercise early in the day, preferably not right before bedtime. Exercise will tend to ramp up your metabolism, get everything going, which is the opposite of what you need for sleep. So ideally, your exercise should be earlier in the day. Next item, avoid stimulants and depressants. So these are things like caffeine, which interfere with melatonin production and your sleep cycles, and alcohol as well. Alcohol is a depressant. Some people drink alcohol to help them sleep, but there's a lot of research on this. Alcohol may help you feel like you're sleeping, but your sleep is disturbed and is not restful. So avoid those stimulants and depressants. Next one, your bed should be quiet, dark, and comfortable, and probably a little bit on the cool side. So, but it should still be comfortable. And that one seems pretty obvious. And then finally, have a bedtime ritual. And we all know that children have their little ritual that they go through. They have to go to the bathroom, get a drink, have a bedtime story, hug mommy, whatever the ritual is, and that is part of their going to sleep, mentally, emotionally, moving towards sleep time. And adults really are not that much different. It's helpful for us to have a ritual. So I would recommend that you be intentional about developing a ritual. You probably have some rituals already, even if you haven't thought about it. But be intentional about making those rituals that will support you, not only in getting a good night's sleep, but also in the rest of the goals that you have in life. So maybe consider a practice of gratitude, of thinking, reflecting on the day and what you have to be thankful for. Perhaps prayer, maybe a deep breathing exercise, those sorts of things would be appropriate. And then once you get in bed to go to sleep, then you should be all ready for a good night's sleep. And that's it for our topic today. Next week, I anticipate that we'll have a special guest to share our topic with us, the final T in the New Start acronym. If you don't know what that is already, go back. I'll put the link in the description below to episode 1, where we review the New Start acronym and what it means. And so go watch that. And next week, we'll look forward to hearing about the final T in the New Start. Until then, God bless you and rest well, my friends.